let's understand this mystical dialectical material process. And why do I call it mystical? Well, when we look at Hegel, we're going to understand that it's mystical. But when we go to Marx, as everyone probably knows, hopefully, Marx turns Hegel on his head. And Marx will be influenced by not just Hegel, but also a couple other figures like Saint-Simon and like Feuerbach. So Saint-Simon, Hegel, and Feuerbach are the three key influences on early young Marx, when Marx is a member of the young Hegelians. Later on, Marx will incorporate other influences like Darwin. But when we think about Hegel, we have to remember that Hegel has multiple influences as well that are not restricted to Plato or dialecticians of the ancient Greek world like Heraclitus, but certain Renaissance Hermetic figures and Kabbalists who will be a crucial influence on the figure of Hegel. And I'll list some of those figures here in a moment when we get to looking at a little bit of Hegel. And this will be coming from the excellent academic text, Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, by Dr. Alexander McGee from Long Island University. This is a pretty well-known, well, I guess in Hegelian studies it's a well-known book, but not many people have actually read this book. But the book goes on to demonstrate the various Rosicrucian secret society influences on the figure of Hegel when developing his kind of alchemical philosophy. But let's go all the way back to Heraclitus. Heraclitus flourished around 500 BCE, and he is the critic of his predecessors and contemporaries for failing to see the unity of all experience. And so we have an attempt at a monistic perspective. What is monism? Monism is the idea that all reality is one thing. It could be one thing in different sense. It could be matter. All reality is that one thing that is matter. It could be ideas. All reality is that one thing that is ultimately just an idea. And so Platonism, for example, is an idealist philosophy that you could argue is ultimately monistic. You might also argue that perhaps Platonism is dualistic. Zoroastrianism, right? That's a religion, or various Gnostic groups. Those are religious structures and narratives that are basically dualistic, in that all reality is fundamentally two types of things: God versus matter, light versus dark, etc. Those are dualistic approaches. But when we come to the character of Heraclitus, he is a monistic philosopher. All reality is what? What is that one big thing? It is logos. But what for him is logos? Well, in one sense, he says opposites are necessary for life. They are like a unified system of balanced exchanges. The world itself consists of law-like interchanges of elements. And so if you go back to Empedocles and the pre-socratics, they will list out the four elements and then perhaps ether as the fifth element. And these elements are always kind of colliding and bumping and causing and doing different things and producing different things, right? Men and women come together, they produce a kid. Fire comes together with water and it produces heat, it produces steam, right? The water evaporates. And so all of life is characterized, did you notice that, as oppositional necessity. Opposites are necessary for life. Day, night, dark, light, white, black, male, female, cold, hot, etc. But it is a unified, law-like interchange of this perpetual flux. And what is the best symbol of this for Heraclitus? Fire. Why fire? Because fire is hot. It is always moving. It is ultimately constantly changing. And the mystico-metaphysical religious significance here is that all of reality, since it is supposedly just atoms and molecules bumping around and moving, all reality is fundamentally, ultimately pure flux. Again, coming back to Heraclitus. Now, keep in mind that the usage of fire there is relevant because fire is going to be a perpetual symbol that Marxist socialist revolutionaries throughout the later centuries post-Enlightenment will use as their chief symbol. In fact, they will actually hearken back to not just Heraclitus, but even to the ancient Zoroastrians in the character of Weishaupt, to point out that because the Zoroastrians worshipped fire as this revolutionary principle, furthering the duality, right? Because there's always this interchange. What is it that symbolizes the constant flux, the constant change? Again, fire, which is perpetually always in motion and movement. Thus, and we will look at this as one of our key source texts for this discussion, the classic book by James Billington, Fire in the Minds of Men, Origins of the Revolutionary Faith. Not an accident that he titled his book Fire in the Minds of Men, because the revolutionary philosophy, all the way back to these guys, is symbolized by fire. And when we look to the predecessors to the French Revolution, the characters of Buonarroti and Adam Weishaupt, not talking about conspiracy theories, but the actual history of Adam Weishaupt, he will utilize Pythagorean, Zoroastrian, and Heraclitian symbology for his communistic philosophy. For those that don't know, Adam Weishaupt was a communist prior to Karl Marx. And for those that don't know, prior to Adam Weishaupt, Pythagoras and Plato were communists prior to Karl Marx. And it's not even disputed when you get into the academic literature on this. I had undergrad and grad classes where we covered the history of the French Revolution through many academic texts. So I know this history very well. But keep in mind that James Billington is not a conspiracy theorist. Billington was a believer in the revolutionary philosophy. In fact, he was the Librarian of Congress. And so this is a historical political science history text by the Librarian of Congress. It is a famous academic text. It is not a conspiracy text. And of course, being at the Library of Congress, James Billington, of course, favors the American Girondin side of the revolution over the Jacobin side. But nevertheless, he still gives a lot of credence and honor and obeisance to the revolutionary communist ethos of the Jacobins, who were the radical communists following Weishaupt in the French Revolution. In other words, the Jacobins believed in no private property. Your wife is my wife. We share all things in common. Literal communists. Men and women are completely equal. Whereas the Girondins were the more, quote, conservative revolutionaries who believed in private property, who believed in distinctions between genders, etc. Doesn't mean that they're not still revolutionary philosophers. They were, right? The merchant class, the nobility in the French Revolution, the Lafayettes, these kinds of characters, they were the Girondins. They believed in right-wing revolution. So ever since the French Revolution, we have been stuck in a choice between two forms of revolutionary philosophy. Do you want communism, socialism of the Jacobin sort and the Marxist sort? Or do you want revolutionary philosophy of the American founding fathers sort? That's really all that's offered to you in the modern world since the French Revolution. There's really no other options. And yes, I understand that laissez-faire economics is just a older form of revolution, merchant class revolutionary philosophy of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Locke. But that also is an Anglo-empiricist revolutionary Enlightenment philosophy that's just the dialectical opposition to the socialism of that time. And yes, there were socialisms all the way back to the ancient world. Again, going back to figures like Pythagoras and Plato. Plato's book is called The Republic. And in The Republic, the Guardian class in particular holds all things in common. And so you have a proto-communism in the ideal republic of Plato. Eventually this gets a little bit modified by later Plato in the Laws, where he erects a secret society that governs the what he calls Magnesia, the new form of the republic. In Magnesia, it's governed by an intelligence operative secret society group called the Council of Night. And so it doesn't really change a whole lot, except that you have a de-emphasizing of the philosopher king, and it's more so run by a council of wise oligarchs or Olympians. basically the way we're governed nowadays with a Kissinger, a Brzezinski, a coalition of oligarchs and councils and steering committees, really modeled, I would say, you could argue probably on the basis of Plato's later work, The Laws of Magnesia. But regardless, there's still proto-communism in Plato's Republic, because the guardian class has all things in common, including wives and children. So back to Heraclitus. For Heraclitus, notice that the logos here is not what we think of in Orthodox Christianity or in John 1's sense of the logos. So notice how we have to be careful how we define words, right? Logos doesn't mean the same thing in every philosopher and across every system. That's called the word concept fallacy. And a lot of Roman Catholics trade on this bait and switch argument where they will say, look, all the philosophers are talking about logos. That's what John means in John 1. Well, there might be some overlap, but that doesn't mean that they mean the same thing. For example, Heraclitus's logos is an all-pervading monistic force. It is the composite totality of all of reality that is the logos in flux, in movement, and in process. Okay, we're not pantheists. Jesus is not the world of flux. Jesus, the logos, is the second person of the Godhead. That is not what Heraclitus is teaching. So there's not the same referent between Heraclitus's logos and John's logos in John 1. Roman Catholics, can you understand this? Natural theology, can you understand this? There are different references there. Now, it is true that what Greek philosophers were seeking for when they talked about the all-pervading idea of logos ultimately is grasping in the dark for the person of Christ. But it is not grasping in the dark for generic monad theism. There is no generic theism. There is only triad, and the energies of God are only manifested in a triadic mode, as is it Losky or Manzarides argues. I think it's Manzarides. The world is not to be identified in any particular substance, but with ongoing process governed by, quote, law of change. Now, let's presupp this right from the outset, because this presuppositional critique will apply to every process philosophy system out there. Very easy to refute this. Notice the fundamental law, the unchanging, supposedly non-material principle, the starting point, the first principle of this system is the law. Now, law cannot be reduced to matter here. It must be an existing metaphysical truth principle that is immaterial and non-variant to be a law. Otherwise, it's not a law. The law is that all of reality is change. All of reality is subject to ongoing process. Number one, it's a universal claim. So how do we know that Heraclitus knows this? What is the justification epistemically for saying all of reality is flux? Second, if all reality is flux, then the proposition all reality is flux is no longer true and must also be subject to flux. Very simple presuppositional critique of the first principle of Heraclitianism and all dialectical philosophy. Maybe accepting Hegel and a few of the German idealists who might not believe that all reality is flux. They will have probably some place for the absolute or the universal. Certainly, for example, Plato wouldn't believe that all reality is flux, right? Plato would disagree with this. In fact, Plato later is Plato and Aristotle are trying to resolve the questions of the pre-socratics. Questions like the one and the many. Questions like, what is the fundamental nature of all that exists? Is it fire? Is it water? Is it flux? Is it permanence? Parmenides, Zeno, all these guys trying to answer this question. Plato and Aristotle will also try to deal with a pre-Socratic question known as the question of identity or change over time. Many of the pre-Socratics were preoccupied with this metaphysical question. And Aristotle and Plato both attempt to give answers to that. Aristotle's causes are his answer to the pre-Socratic question of identity through change or identity over time. That's the whole point, the whole origin of Aristotle's causes. So Heraclitus is the first Western philosopher to go beyond physical theory in search of metaphysical foundations and moral applications. So notice that the argument that all reality is process is a metaphysical claim. And it doesn't matter whether you think that all reality is ideas or all reality is matter. When you say all reality is matter, that's a metaphysical claim. And ontology is a branch of metaphysics. Against all the Marxists who had no clue what I was talking about the other day. Literally no knowledge of philosophy at all. Trying to debate, no clue what these words mean, what a metaphysical or ontological claim is. And Heraclitus lived in Ephesus on the Ionian coast of Asia Minor, not far from Miletus, the birthplace of philosophy. We know nothing about his life other than that it can be gleaned from his own statements. For all ancient biographies of him consist of nothing more than inferences of imaginary constructions based on what he said. Plato thought he wrote after Parmenides, but perhaps it is more likely that he wrote before Parmenides. He is criticized by name by important thinkers with whom he disagrees, although he doesn't mention Parmenides. Parmenides argued, contrary to Heraclitus, that all reality is flux, change is an illusion. Parmenides is the opposite of Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, no, you are wrong. All reality is flux, not permanence. So you have it backwards. Dialectical opposition, you see. Later philosophers then attempt to solve this dialectical ideological conflict by a synthesis. This will be part of the reason why later process philosophers like Hegel argue that it's not just matter that's in motion, it's also ideas, and ultimately for Hegel, all reality is ideas. Ideas and their exchange are producing a synthesis, which is a gradual upward movement and ascent of history to become pure spirit. That's the Hegelian view. That's the omega point. That's the cunning of reason and all the stuff that Hegel talked about. Now, again, that's going to be all of this will be very relevant for Karl Marx. So we can't understand Marx until we understand these things first. And it's not controversial. I studied under Marxists in college, trained under Frankfurt School people. So my professor, my graduate and undergraduate advisor in philosophy, trained under his advisor was under Habermas. So I have direct descent from Frankfurt School. I make that joke, but I'm also not joking. But I have Marxistolic succession through studying under people who studied under Habermas. So that doesn't mean that my arguments are correct. I'm just saying that that's my pedigree. That's my lineage in terms of academic study. I studied a lot of Marxism in college and in grad school. That does not make me a Marxist expert. I do not care that much about Marxism to become a Marxist expert. But I guarantee you, compared to 99% of internet Marxists, I know way more Marxism and have studied way more Marxist texts, especially from Horkheimer, Adorno, Habermas, and these figures out of the critical school, than any of these other goobers. I also understand that the Frankfurt School is not identical to early Marx, and it's not identical to Soviet bloc Marxism. I am well aware of all of these distinctions and schisms within the religion known as Marxism. Yes, exactly. Marxism is a religion with high priests, mystical texts, mystical jargon, an inner core elite, a hierarchy, saints like Dzerzhinsky, who was considered the pure flame, the saint of Marxists. He was the great Marxist martyr, you could say, because supposedly he was willing to give everything to the revolution, is the philosophy of Dzerzhinsky.